Welcome to our lecture on Enlightenment Christianity. And in this lecture, the student will describe the various threads that contributed to the Enlightenment. What streams flowed into this river of thought, right? The student will explore the various Enlightenment thinkers out there who were representatives of this Enlightenment thought, right? The student will evaluate the impact of the Enlightenment on Christianity. How is our thinking as Christians shaped by the Enlightenment? And I think the best place to start, or the most logical place to start, is defining what the Enlightenment is. And sometimes the Enlightenment is known as the Age of Reason, because the Enlightenment was this philosophical project that marked a shift in Western epistemology. Now I have to define what epistemology is, right? Instead of asking the question, what can I know? Enlightenment thinkers wrestled with the question of epistemology. How can we know what we know? How do we know what is true, right? Medieval thinkers wrestled with what one can know of God. And starting around the 17th century, thinkers turned their attention to how we can know things about God. And there are several different threads that weave through the Enlightenment. You have philosophical threads and philosophers wrestling with the nature of the mind and truth and such. You have religious and theological threads, this conversation that's been going on for centuries about who this God is that we worship. Starting in the Enlightenment, you have scientific threads. Okay, science is discovering new things about the world, and how does that jive with what we know the Bible teaches? There are even political threads. How should people be governed? What is the good life? So I think the more helpful way to approach the Enlightenment these days is not just defining what is the Enlightenment, but also asking the question, which Enlightenment are we talking about? Because we have the Enlightenment unfolding in several different areas. You have Germany, you have France, you have Britain, you have America. The Enlightenment was getting into France and all those countries in between as well. But we're going to focus on three centers of the Enlightenment, right? The British, American, and French Enlightenment. And we're going to discuss them as separate movements because they really did have different characters and flavors, even though they did share a certain set of assumptions. But before we get into these three centers of the Enlightenment, let me talk a little bit about the origins of the Enlightenment. Where did it come from? Why was it important when it became popular? And we'll start with asking questions of knowledge. And questions of knowledge, how can we know what we know, seem to trace back as far as we have records. The ancient Greeks wrestled with it. We've talked about how Plato and Aristotle came up with different methods for knowing what we know, different methods of figuring out what the essence of chair is. Aristotle developed both the philosophical epistemology, and he penned a treatise on logic, as well as offering a scientific description of the world around him. And the medieval world continued to wrestle with this question. Peter Abelard claimed that reason and faith were virtually synonymous, so that if something is not proved by reason, then it cannot be held by the Christian. So it's not like the Enlightenment invented these questions of knowledge. But during the Enlightenment, these questions of how we can know, these epistemological questions, came to the forefront. And one of the early thinkers that drove this question to the forefront was a guy named Nicholas Copernicus. Copernicus was born late 15th century, lived through most of the 16th century, or the first half of the 16th century. And Copernicus is known for his famous revolution, right? Interestingly, Copernicus's revolution didn't change his world. It changed our world, right? In his lifetime, people didn't realize how revolutionary his thought was. Or maybe they did, and that's why they resisted it, right? But through observation and calculation, Copernicus concluded that the Earth is not the center of the solar system. Actually, the sun was the center of the solar system. And this challenged not only the dominant scientific view, it challenged the dominant theological view as well, because in, 4, 5, 6 places, the Bible says, such as Psalm 104:5, God set the earth on its foundations. It can never be moved. Right? And this is echoed in 1 Chronicles 16:30, Psalm 33:9, Psalm 93:1, Psalm 96:10, Psalm 119:89 through 90. So in other words, it wasn't just one verse in the Bible that says this. This is repeated, especially by the psalmists. Copernicus's conclusions were not enlightenment per se, but he signaled a shift in how knowledge was developed. Right? After Copernicus came Galileo, and he lived 16th into the 17th century. He was both an astronomer and a physicist, and he fought for Copernicus's conclusions. He was so committed to Copernicus's conclusions that he faced the Inquisition in 1615. While both Copernicus and Galileo challenged the church, Galileo challenged the church in writing. And that's why Galileo faced a lot more opposition from the church than Copernicus did. But both Copernicus and Galileo were committed to their faith, and at no point did they see a conflict between their faith and their scientific conclusions. Right? So this idea that the Enlightenment and its emphasis on science somehow undermines faith or somehow marginalizes faith just doesn't square with the historic development of the Enlightenment. The third figure in the Enlightenment that's important for us to consider is a guy named Francis Bacon. And he lived in the 16th, 17th century. Bacon considered himself a theologian of the natural world. He didn't actually consider himself a scientist. Voltaire would later call him the father of modern science. But Bacon was a committed Protestant. And there was no single scientific method that developed from this time. Technically speaking, there's not a single method that has been developed in our own time. But the Baconian method is the closest that we see to a modern scientific method. And it starts from the point of doubting the senses. And it uses intuition to develop a hypothesis, right? And then you test the hypothesis with experiments. This is the scientific method that you learn in high school. And this comes from Bacon's book, The Great Instauration. And it was organized around 6 major subjects or chapters based on the 6 days of creation. We see a biblical structure to this. And this book that I'm not sure I pronounced correctly, actually I'm fairly certain I pronounced it incorrectly, is more of a theological textbook that examines nature. And it began with the idea of original sin. It began with our sinfulness. And it recognized that sinful people study a sinful creation, a corrupted creation. And sin is a central concern in examining the created world. However, Bacon argues because of salvation, we can now actually do science because we are Christian. Science, far from being an atheistic tool that pushes faith to the margins, Bacon claims it can only be done by Christians. The work of grace in the context of salvation restores an ability to do science. The natural world is redeemed. So Bacon sees himself as a part of the Reformation discussion. He doesn't see himself as joining into an Enlightenment or a scientific conversation. Bacon actually wrote a treatise against atheism. A little philosophy inclines to atheism, but depth in philosophy inclines towards religion. The fourth representative character we're going to look at as the forefathers, the godfathers of the Enlightenment, is René Descartes. And he was primarily a 17th century thinker. And he is known as the father of the Cartesian revolution. Descartes was a committed Catholic, and he sought to ground claims and truth to something more reliable than personal confessions, right? So his epistemology reached beyond the pale of Catholicism. And even though he considered himself a devout Catholic, his books were actually banned by the Catholic Church. Descartes didn't root truth in the institution of the church. He tried to find something more universal than that. And he found it in doubt, actually. Descartes applied this radical skepticism towards the world. And he doubted everything, including his own existence. And this is where Descartes developed what we call today the evil genius hypothesis. Like, how can we know that the outside world is real? How do we know that the outside world isn't just sensations that an evil genius is feeding us? It's also known as the vat in the brain situation, right? How do we know that we are not just brains that have electrodes and an evil genius is sending sensations that this table is hard? How do we know that there is a table and that it's hard? If this sounds like the movie The Matrix, this is exactly what The Matrix was intended to illustrate, was Cartesian philosophy. So Descartes embraced this radical skepticism, and he doubts that the table exists, and he doubts that he exists. And then he realized there's something that he could not doubt. The fact that he was doubting, right? And this gave birth to the very famous saying, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. It actually started as dubito ergo sum, I doubt, therefore I am. And Descartes found this I think, therefore I am statement as the bedrock first principle. The one thing he can prove is real. And if he can prove one thing is real, he can prove everything else rests on it. So he could prove that he was real, and he could prove that the outside world is real. But notice, it's not an appeal to Scripture. It's not an appeal to the church. This is more of a geometric type proof. And the Enlightenment started as a number of Christians who applied a radical skepticism to their observation of the world around them. That sentence doesn't make sense. Let me try that again. Now that we've discussed some of the forerunners of the Enlightenment, the foundations of the Enlightenment, let me turn our attention to the British Enlightenment. And Britain in the 17th century was emerging from their religious and political turmoil under the Tudors. If you remember, the Tudor dynasty was not a stable one. The Tudors emerged victorious from the War of the Roses, and in order to secure the dynasty, in order to secure stability, then the king needed to have heirs. And King Henry VIII's father, King Henry VII, had two boys. The older Arthur died, and Henry VIII became the heir apparent to the throne. The thing that most people know about King Henry VIII is he had 6 wives, and a lot of people just assume he's a glutton or he's filled with lust. That may be true, but that is actually not why he had 6 wives. He had 6 wives because he needed a male heir if he was going to leave a stable England to his ancestors, which he sort of did, and it didn't work. But the point is, 17th century England was just becoming stable after a long period of turmoil. And in the 17th century, we have the emergence of one of the greatest figures in the Enlightenment, Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton properly was a natural philosopher, and he's been accused of being something of a deist. I personally think that that's anachronistic. That's reading back into Isaac Newton something that he may not have believed. Now, some who followed Isaac Newton's thought did embrace deism, but that doesn't mean that Newton himself was a deist. One of Newton's primary writings was a writing called the Principia, published in 1687. And this provided a description of the natural universe that challenged the Aristotelian and Ptolemaic conventions. In other words, Newton was drawing on the methodology and the thinking of these forerunners of the Enlightenment, the Copernicus, Galileo, Bacon, and Descartes, and starting to describe the world around him in different terms using different methods. And Newton painted a picture of a universe that operated mechanistically. It was regular. It could be predicted. It could be described by mathematics. Newton outlined his 3 laws of motion and his law of universal gravitation in the Principia. So this is this massive step forward in thinking about the world around us. But it's important to note that Isaac Newton did not abandon his faith in order to be a mathematician, a scientist. He actually saw it as a part of his faith. I will admit he was not a very good theologian, but he actually wrote more theology books, books on the Bible, than he did books on science. Even though his books did not always have good theology, his observations and his way of looking at the world was actually based on good theology. Newton recognized that God created a world that operated according to regular laws, right? When we look at Babylonian science versus Egyptian science, Babylonian science is very mathematical, but has a view of the gods that were very volatile, very unpredictable. Egyptian gods were very predictable, very stable. A lot of historians attribute that to the regularness of the flooding of the Nile versus the irregularity of the flooding of the Tigris and the Euphrates. Secondly, Newton believed that these laws of nature were constant. They didn't change. In other words, you could predict them. Therefore, according to Newton, the universe could be explained. You could describe the universe. You could predict it. And his theological foundation led Newton to explore the nature of light in his work, writing a book called Optics and Arithmetics, this new math to describe the world around him. As I said before, Newton also wrote on biblical scholarship. He wrote The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended, Observations on Daniel and the Apocalypse of John, an historical account of 2 notable corruptions of Scripture. So Newton was more concerned about describing the world around him than he was with being a scientist strictly, right? And in order to understand the world around you, he felt like he needed to understand the principles of Scripture, the document written by the creator of this world. Second figure in the British Enlightenment was a guy named John Locke. And he was primarily a 17th century philosopher. And he wrote widely in the areas of philosophy, religion, and political thought. In his essays concerning human understanding, Locke challenged the idea that human thought comes pre-programmed, that we don't have a sense of the structure of reality when we're born. He believed that the mind was a blank slate. The term used there is a tabula rasa, a blank slate, upon which impressions are made on the senses, right? And while the medieval world defaulted to an assumption of absolutism, because of the contact that Enlightenment cultures, Enlightenment Britain had with other cultures throughout the globe, this medieval absolute way of looking at the world was challenged. And it turns out not everyone agreed on things like God and morality, right? Britain was just discovering that as the age of exploration was exploding. While Descartes developed the method of determining first principles, Locke developed an epistemology not based on first principles, not based on principles you can work out in your head and then work everything else out. No, John Locke based his knowledge of the world based on sense impression, right? Descartes was more of a Platonic thinker. Locke was more of an Aristotelian. Locke did not share the skepticism of either Bacon or Descartes. Locke didn't start with original sin and the corruption of our senses in this world. Instead, he freely affirmed the ability of people to acquire knowledge through the senses. And this approach became known as empiricism. Right? Locke also wrote a book called The Reasonableness of Christianity as Delivered in the Scriptures. And this was published in 1695. And the thesis of this book is actually contained in the name, that Christianity could be understood through the application of reason, right? Through sense impressions that we can understand and codify. Like I said before, Locke did not hold to the same conviction of original sin that Bacon and Descartes had. So Locke didn't think that our sense perception was distorted by anything. Instead, Locke believed that reason is a sufficient light by which to understand God. Locke didn't consider this a departure from Christianity. He considered this an application of his Enlightenment epistemology so that he can understand Christianity better. He subjected the revealed word to reason in order to understand God. And at this point, Locke can rightly be criticized of abandoning that which makes Christianity Christianity. Original sin, the need of a Savior, Jesus as a substitutionary atonement. You see how all those dominoes kind of fall or rest on original sin. Another pair of Enlightenment thinkers from Britain were Hutchinson and Shaftesbury. Francis Hutchinson was born in the late 17th century, wrote during the 18th century, and he was an Irish philosopher who served as chair of moral philosophy at Glasgow. He wrote the book Inquiry Concerning Beauty, Order, Harmony, and Design, and Inquiry Concerning Moral Goodness and Evil. Like Newton, Hutchinson believed that the world had order, harmony, and proportion to it. And this was not only reflected in the physical world, but in the moral world as well. In his essay on the nature and conduct of the passions and affections, and his illustrations upon moral sense, Hutchinson believed that sensation was a key element to knowledge. So here he agreed with Locke. And Hutchinson incorporated the moral world when he wrote about the affections. The affections are the idea of both the mind and the will joined together, right? Hutchinson's thought was echoed by the third Earl of Shaftesbury, and we get a lot more of this moral reasoning talking about the affections in Shaftesbury. But we wouldn't be doing justice to the British Enlightenment unless we did talk about the rise of deism. And despite the Christian background of the founders of the Enlightenment, their thought was leveraged by others to modify traditional revealed religion. While Enlightenment and scientific thought did not require the marginalization of faith, there were a number of thinkers that used Enlightenment thought towards those ends. And one of the most famous is a guy named Lord Herbert of Cherbury. He was a 17th century thinker. And he believed in a natural principle that was innate to all people. And this innate natural principle included three essentials: the existence of God, the moral law, and a belief in divine retribution. So Cherbury did not share traditional Christianity, but he did believe in the absolute nature of the moral law and how it was common to all men, right? Another one of these deistic thinkers is a guy named John Toland. He was a 17th, 18th century figure that was famous for his book, Christianity Not Mysterious. And this is a classic of deistic thought, because Toland claimed that everything that can be known about Christianity, everything that can be known about God, can be known by reason, or else it can't be true. Obviously, Toland got rid of ideas like original sin, because it's hard to understand how one guy who ate an apple thousands of years ago could impute sin to us today. Got rid of ideas like the Trinity, got rid of the authority of the Bible. Anything that Toland could not understand for himself, he just assumed, well, then no one can understand it, right? It's not true. It can't be understood. Another deistic thinker is a guy named William Whiston, another 17th century Newtonian theologian. And Whiston defended Newton's theology and science while holding to a high view of the scriptures. Yet at the same time, Whiston rejected Nicene Trinitarianism. And he promoted this idea of Christian primitivism, that we have to get back to first century Christianity before the intrusion of ideas like the deity of Christ and the Trinity. A fourth deistic thinker is a guy named Matthew Tyndale. And he was famous for his text, Christianity as Old as Creation. And he relied on Locke's epistemology, claiming that nature was all that was needed to understand God. In other words, we can understand everything we need to know about God by looking at the created world. Interestingly, while each of these deistic thinkers abandoned traditional biblical Christianity, none of them abandoned Judeo-Christian ethics, right? However, they had created a system of theology that made it possible to understand the world without God. And we see the effects of that in our own culture today. So next we're going to talk about the American Enlightenment. And the American Enlightenment, like most things in America, is actually derivative of the British Enlightenment. And this isn't surprising because America, especially in the 17th and most of the 18th century, was actually a British colony. And the works of Locke, Newton, and Hutchinson and others slowly trickled into the colonies throughout the 18th century. So America was actually British. So it makes sense that we would get many of these British authors here. And the thought of John Locke had a particularly deep influence. And the impact of Lockean epistemology was primarily seen in the theological trajectory of the New World. British deism had its own proponents in 18th century New England, guys like Charles Chauncey and Jonathan Mayhew. So we can say that the British Enlightenment actually transplanted itself into the American colonies. America embraced its philosophical strands mainly through the clergy. The clergy were the ones that were getting these British Enlightenment books, reading them, and then articulating New England religious thought within this British Enlightenment framework. It embraced Britain's scientific strands as reflected in the works of guys like Benjamin Franklin and the American Philosophical Society. It embraced the political strands of British Enlightenment thought in the American Revolution. And founding fathers such as Thomas Jefferson drew heavily on Locke to develop something of a unique political structure. Enlightenment assumptions concerning the inherent goodness of man combined with traditional theological beliefs to create a society where governance authority is vested in the people, but heavily checked and balanced by competing interests. The ensuing revolution was an attempt to maintain the colonists' rights as British subjects and not to institute something new. This is something that I think confuses a lot of my students because I believe, and I believe the historical record shows, the American Revolution was not a war to create something new. It was a war to capture the rights afforded to every Englishman, rights that were being denied to British citizens in America. So we fought a war so we can have traditional British rights like no taxation without representation, right? So we can see not only in the direction of religion in the 18th century, especially in New England, where there is this more move towards deism, move towards Arminianism, eventually a move towards Unitarianism. And then in the American Revolution, the appropriation of these British Enlightenment concepts in our Declaration, in our Constitution. We can see how the Enlightenment took root in America, but did so as a uniquely British phenomenon. The third center of the Enlightenment we're going to talk about is France and the French Enlightenment. And while the American colonies sat on the outer orbit of the British Empire, France actually sat in the heart of the European continent. And while the British and American Enlightenment sought a new foundation for a real knowledge of the world, France's Enlightenment actually drove them towards relativism. And that's interesting how they're both drawing on the same strands of thought. And Britain and America are grounding themselves in reality, and France is moving away from reality into relativism, right? The age of exploration brought European culture into contact with other cultures who did not share their values either religiously or morally. They ran into cultures where multiple wives was an accepted thing. And France started to question, okay, these absolutes that we have been affirming for hundreds of years, this Judeo-Christian ethic, is this really true? And one of the thinkers that drove French Enlightenment thought is a guy named Voltaire, or Francois-Marie Arouet. And Voltaire was raised a Catholic. He studied under Jesuits before studying law, and he fell in love with a Protestant refugee from France. But Voltaire eventually was imprisoned because he had this physical altercation with a French noble, and the king had to get involved, and Voltaire was thrown into the Bastille. And this seems to be a turning point in his life. This is where he takes the name Voltaire. And this network of Catholic, aristocratic, monarchical nobles that Voltaire was a part of before, he gets thrown in jail by them. And now he is looking to subvert this aristocratic context in which he was raised. Voltaire negotiated an exile to England instead of imprisonment, which is where he came into contact with Protestantism, where he came into contact with the British Enlightenment. And in Voltaire's work, Philosophical Letters, he commends Protestants, and he actually defends Quakers as well. And he involves himself in the scientific revolution, this British Enlightenment that was already underway in Britain. Eventually, Voltaire was allowed to return to France, and he returned to Paris an aggrieved person with this broad base of experience with other ideas, other religious ideas, social, political, and scientific ideas. Voltaire began to read Leibniz, and he began to embrace determinism. And he, not so much embrace it as he did reject it. Sorry about that. He wrote a treatise challenging Leibniz's determinism called Candide. Voltaire considered himself a champion for the oppressed, and he abandoned Christianity because he saw it as this vile plague on humanity. He saw the Catholic faith as wedded to the French monarchy and became an instrument of oppression. And he believed that the political powers of the state must be checked. So here we can see, unlike the founders of the Enlightenment movement, Voltaire was using these alternate explanations for why the world is the way it is to marginalize religion. He began to see religion as the problem and not the solution. And whereas the British Enlightenment, with all its flaws, led to the American Revolution, the French Enlightenment, this abandonment of Judeo-Christian ethics, led to the French Revolution. And in 1792, the political Enlightenment ideas of liberté, égalité, and fraternité led the French people to dispose of their monarch. They beheaded Louis XVI, I think it was, and his wife Marie Antoinette. And the bureaucrat that was put in charge of most of France was a guy named Maximilien Robespierre. And he began this, what he called reign of terror. And he used this term terror to say, well, the enemies of the French Revolution must be terrorized. They must be converted through terror. I don't think he realized that we would be using it today to describe Robespierre's ideas themselves. But he kind of led this reign of terror where he organized the execution of thousands upon thousands of Frenchmen. He oversaw the abolishing of religion in Paris especially, but all over France. And he replaced Catholicism initially with the cult of reason and replaced chancels and cathedrals with these goddesses and dancers to the cult of reason. Although Robespierre was never a big fan of atheism, so eventually he promoted the cult of the supreme being, this idea that there is a God who upholds a moral standard. But at the same time, he was executing anyone who disagreed with him. The British Enlightenment led to the American Revolution. And there was many problems with the British Enlightenment. And it distorted traditional Christianity, but it held on to this Judeo-Christian ethic that we still benefit from today. Whereas the French Enlightenment used the British Enlightenment ideas to marginalize religion, marginalize the role of God in society. And they tried to build a society based on Enlightenment principles and not on God. And it only lasted a couple of years. Right now, we have Scandinavian countries that like to claim that they are basing their societies on reason and not religion. And as Tim Keller has pointed out, the problem with that is the reasonable conclusions that these Scandinavian countries have come to, they only came to those conclusions after imbibing hundreds of years of Christianity. Ideas like humans have dignity and there should be equal justice under the law. Those were foreign ideas until Christianity came on the scene. So in the same way that the Enlightenment led France down a dangerous path, I think the very idea of building a society on something other than at the very basic level of Judeo-Christian ethic is folly. And we can see the two trajectories of the Enlightenment, the British Enlightenment versus the French Enlightenment, as proof of the necessity of a Judeo-Christian ethic. Well, I hope in this lecture you're able to explore some of the various threads that run through the Enlightenment, the British thread, the American thread, and the French thread. I hope you were able to understand how the forerunners of the Enlightenment, guys like Copernicus, Galileo, Bacon, and Descartes, laid the intellectual foundation for guys like Isaac Newton and John Locke, guys like Benjamin Franklin, guys like Voltaire. I hope you were able to see where the tension between Enlightenment thought and scientific thought arose with reference to religion. It's not a necessary connection. It's a connection that was only made by some of the Enlightenment thinkers. But I think it is a good opportunity for us to question whether or not science really is at odds with faith today. So I appreciate your time, and we'll see you at the next lecture. Thank you.